The Rav Zatzal, Rabbi Soloveitchik, he gave two fascinating insights into the life of Sarah and her legacy, who and what she is our matriarch, is our mother, what we learned from the great eulogy that was said about her, and it seems a very strange eulogy on the surface, and from the whole story of her burial, the whole negotiation that Avram had to go through. We learn also a great, profound insight. This morning we're going to touch upon those issues. If there's time, we're going to speak about Avraham and his relationship with Yitzchak, if there's time. Well, you read the introduction, Chayei Sarah. What was the life of Sarah? You know who Sarah was? She was Mea Shana. She was 100 years. You know who Sarah was? Esrim Shana. She was 20 years. You know who Sarah was? Sheva Shanim. She was 7 years. Shnei Chayei. That's Sarah's life. She was 100, she was 20, and she was 7. Well, I mean, you don't have to be a student of quantum mechanics or linear algebra. Why don't you just say she was 127? Why do you have to say she was 100 years, she was 20 years, and she was 7 years? Why don't you just say she was 127? That's question number one. Question number two is, what kind of a eulogy is this? Here, the God himself, the Almighty, the Ribono Shel Olam, is giving the hesped, the eulogy for Sarah, and this is what we're told? What kind of insight is that? And that Rashi, that crucial Rashi, the first Rashi in the Parsha, gives us a profound insight into what the Almighty was saying. Because what God was saying, the Almighty was saying about Sarah Imenu, that is the goal of every Jew. And what's that? She was 100 years. She was 20 years, she was 7 years. A 7-year-old is radically different than a 20-year-old. And a 20-year-old, personality-wise, is radically different than 100. But you know what happens with most people? They mature. And they not only mature in a positive way, but they leave behind everything that was associated with their childhood. When they're 20, they're radically different. And we'll explain what we mean. And the same thing is true very often with an older person, someone of 100 years old. Very often, unfortunately, they're radically different, and they've left everything behind from when they were 20. What do we mean? Now, the Rav said there's a different girsa in the Medrash that Rashi's quoting, in the Bereishis Rabbah, and we're going to work with that different girsa. What is a 7-year-old? They're free of sin. You're not responsible for your actions until you attain social maturity. A 7-year-old is naki, is clean from sin. What's a 20-year-old? There's a beauty. They get over that awkwardness that gawky awkwardness of adolescence. That's when a young woman is beautiful at the age of 20. Yofi. What's 100? There's a wisdom that comes with having lived life. So what is the Almighty saying? Sarah at 127, she was like a 7-year-old when it came to sin. She was as pure, she was as decent, she was as innocent as that 7-year-old. In terms of beauty, and we'll talk about what particular aspect of the beauty, at 100 she was as beautiful as a 20-year-old. And yet she had the positive nature of a 100-year-old. What does that mean? You know, Einstein said, when he was asked, Professor Einstein, what separates you from others? There are many brilliant people on the face of this earth. Why have you achieved in nuclear physics? Why have you achieved in theoretical physics what others haven't? And he said, now we know they opened up his skull, they showed the size of his brain. We know that he had a fantastic brain. But you want to know something? He wasn't the only one. You know what he answered? Albert Einstein answered, what sets me apart from others, if there's something that makes me great, I'll tell you what it is. I never stopped asking the questions that I asked as a precocious 5 and 6-year-old. The problem with most of us is we go to first grade or second grade, and you know what happens? You can't blame the teacher, and you can't blame your parents. The kids always asking, why this, why that? They're always questioning, and you stifle them, you squelch them. You don't want to hear it. Well, the problem is we stop asking the questions. We stop losing that excitement, that curiosity of that young, naive kid, of that pristine, where the world is like an open area. It's like a laboratory to explore, to ask. And that Sarah that sense of inquiry, that sense of excitement, that sense of optimism of wanting to learn and explore, she never lost that. She always kept that. Whereas most of us, unfortunately, it gets squelched, it gets suppressed. And we stop asking the questions and we stop having the excitement about learning about life that we need to. What about a 20-year-old? 20-year-old is a time of optimism. They're very idealistic. You look at a college student, you look at somebody in the yeshiva, extremely idealistic, values and principles. What's the difference between a 20-year-old and a 50-year-old? A 50-year-old has been through the ups and downs. They've had failures. They've had disappointments. They've been disappointed by people close to them. They've suffered. They have emotional, psychological scar tissue. That's the difference. And you know what? Unfortunately, people become bitter. People become bitter about life. They lose that optimism. They lose that idealism. Sarah never lost it. Sarah had some major challenges. She dealt with infertility. She was forced to move. She was abducted in Mitzrayim by the Egyptians. She was abducted on the Gaza coast by the Pelishtim. She suffered the disappointment of how her prized disciple turned on her, Hagar, and the way she treated her. She suffered, many, many experiences. But she never lost that idealism. She never lost that optimism. She kept that spirit, that freshness, that excitement, that beauty that's reflected in a young person. And you know something? A lot of times older people, it's a big mistake. They live in the past. They talk about what they did when they were 40 or 30 or 20. They're never building for tomorrow. They're living in a past, in a long gone past. They may be great storytellers, but it's all about what was. That wasn't Sarah. Sarah was a 20-year-old. She always looked forward. She didn't live in the past. What's the greatness of a 100-year-old? There's a wisdom. There's a maturation. There's a subtlety and sophistication that comes from life experience. That naivete, that simplicity of looking at the world in boxes, in black and white, in not seeing shades of gray, in nuance and subtlety. Sarah had that. She had the wisdom, the great, great depth, the profound depth and wisdom of a person who had lived through the vicissitudes of life. That's who Sarah was. She was a woman of 100. She was a woman of 20, and she was a woman of 7. And she's the model. She's the model for every Jew. To keep with us that natural intuition, that curiosity, that innocence of a child, to keep that with us through life. The optimism, the idealism that exists, of a young person, of a young adult, the beauty of a young adult, the looking forward, and yet maintain the maturity, the depth, seeing the world in 3 dimensions with nuance and subtlety of an experienced, wise person. That, of course, we have the famous halacha, mipnei seva takum, the mitzvah in Parshas Kedoshim. We stand up for someone who's 70 years or older. We stand up, mipnei seva takum. Why? To show a sense of respect. Respect for what? Respect for experience. The Gemara, I think it's Rabbi Yossi Aglili, one of the Tanaim in Masechta Kiddushin in the first parak says, afilu zaken ashmai, even for a person that's a Gentile, that doesn't have the Torah education. Why do you stand up when they walk in the room? Because of the life, the street experience, the life experience and wisdom that they have, and we acknowledge that. That's our first point. The second point, superficially one could have read the first aliyah and a half, chapter 23. One could have read that, the beginning of Chayei Sarah, as basically Ephron is a manipulative, very sharp, very smooth mortician, funeral home owner, who takes advantage, Nebuch, of an older, devastated man. He comes back from the Akedah. Yitzchak has gone off to the yeshiva of Shem Ve'ever. And in what's happened, he's dumbfounded by the loss of his soulmate, his life's partner. And he's all alone. And with warmth and nice and sweetness, Ephron dupes Abraham into paying a fortune of money for a cave. You could have read it that way. But the Rav said that's not the pshat. That's not what the Torah is recording here. Something much more profound in something that has great relevance for the generations. What happened? If you look in these 20 psukim, the operative verb that keeps coming up again and again is hear me. Shima'uni, shima'eni, shima'uni. Hear us, shima'enu. He introduces himself with an interesting introduction to the Hittites. The Hittites are the community that lives in the area of Hebron, in the area of the Judean hills that we call Hebron, Kiryat Arba. He says to them, Ger v'toshav anochi imachem. I repeat, Ger v'toshav anochi imachem. 4 words. You know, if anyone had to have a bumper sticker, you see people, it tells you a lot about who they are, the bumper stickers that they put on. Pro-life, pro-choice, pro-gay marriage, anti-gay marriage, Jets, Giants, USC, UCLA, they define themselves by their bumper stickers. If a Jew had to have a bumper sticker, I would say these 4 words would be the bumper sticker that we would have to define ourselves. Ger v'toshav anochi machem. What does that mean? It's an oxymoron. A ger is what? A ger is somebody who's a stranger, who's not a resident alien. Who's not a resident, who's not an Aryan. He's an alien, he's a stranger. What's a toshav? Just the opposite. Someone who's defined and part and parcel of this society, a citizen. So you're either a ger, you're either a stranger, or you're a toshav. You can't be both. What do you mean, ger v'toshav anochi machem? And the Hittites, did not understand that. Because what did they do? You're all familiar with the famous Peyton Manning commercial. The Madison Avenue firm that produced that has won awards from MasterCard. Shows you this, shows you that. Certain things in life are priceless. For everything else, there's MasterCard. There's certain things in life that are priceless. You can't buy them. You can't pay for them. What's an example of that? To be buried in Arlington National Cemetery. It doesn't matter how much money you have. It doesn't matter what your genealogy is. If you haven't fought for the US of A, if you haven't risked your life in battle, you're not entitled to be buried in Arlington National Cemetery. You can't pull strings. You can't buy it. And what's the point? They offered to Avraham the Hittite Arlington National Cemetery. B'mivchar kivarenu kvoras mesecha. In the choicest of our burial plots, the choicest of our sepulchres, please bury your beloved. Please bury Sarah. And they wanted no money. Nothing. They wanted nothing. And they begged him to give him the highest honor. They called him Nisi Elokim Ata B'Sochenu. You're the Prince of God. Nisi Elokim Ata B'Sochenu. What does that mean? Even though they were Hittites, they were pagans, polytheists. But there was an awe, a respect, a reverence for this man. And they were giving him as a stranger, as a Mesopotamian, as a non-pagan. They were giving him their highest honor. To be buried in the Hittite Arlington National Cemetery. What happens? He turns it down. He kept saying, please hear what I'm saying. Shema'uni, please hear me. Tnu li achuzat kever. He needs to buy not just he doesn't want it. He doesn't want it as a gift to participate, to be part of their cemetery. He wants to buy a cemetery, and not just buy it like a 99-year lease. Achuzat kever. What's an achuza? Stay achuza. It's something that is his eternally. It's something that he will pass on to his children, to their children. It's something that becomes an eternal spot for them. What was the disconnect? Where were they? He was hearing them very well. Where were they missing him? They want to give him the highest honor. And he keeps insisting that he has to buy it. And not just buy it, but buy it as an achuza, something which is his and controlled by him and passed on to the next generation of his descendants. When Ephron finally understands it, all of a sudden he goes from a freebie to Arba Meos shekel kesef over la socher, this huge fortune of money, 400 silver shkalim, Not just 400 silver shkalim, over la socher, international currency. What happened? I'll tell you what happened. They finally heard him. They heard him, the words all along. They finally understood him. What was he saying? What was Avraham saying to them? Ger v'toshav anochi machem. When it comes to building this community, when it comes to developing the society, I'm there with my time, my energy, my funds. No one is more American than a Jew. We bleed red, white, and blue. No one is going to do more to support the Hittite future and the Hittite society than Avraham. But there are certain areas where there's a distinction. There are certain areas where we go down the path less followed. We go down a different road. So at the same time that we're a toshav, we're a ger. It's a dialectical existence. We oscillate between two poles, between being the resident and being a ger, an alien. We oscillate between those two poles. When it comes to paying taxes, when it comes to building the society, developing natural resources, when it comes to technology, when it comes to helping the poor, when it comes to education, when it comes to everything, we are there. We're at the cutting edge, we're supporting, and we're giving our time, our energy, and our funds. But there are certain areas where we have a different destiny. And one manifestation of that different destiny of being a ger is the burial plot. What is the notion of where you're buried? What's the implication of where you're buried? Where you're buried is a reflection of where you're going. It's referring to your ultimate destiny. It, so to speak, is the shar. It's the entry into a different world. It's a different world that Judaism represents. It's a different world that we leave behind. It's a different world that we stand for. We have a different destiny. Eliezer and Yishmael are great people. They're great people. And they accompany Yitzchak and Avraham on the Akedah, going back to Parshat Vayera. But when Avraham says, do you see what I see? And Yitzchak sees that there's a unique cloud hovering over that mountain. And Yishmael and Eliezer says, I don't see anything. I don't see anything. It's clear sky to me. Then Avram turns to them. He says, Shvu lechem po im chamor. You stay here with the chamor, meaning from the word chomer. You stay not just with the donkey, you stay with the material world. Vani vanar nelcha ad ko. I and the lad, we will go ad ko. What's ko? It's not ad there, ad sham. No, it doesn't say ad sham. Ad ko. What's ko? It's referring to a different destiny. The notion of the sacrifice that Avraham and Yitzchak engaged in at the Akedah, Eliezer and Yishmael are great people. They're not obligated. They don't live that sacrificial life. That's not where they're at. This is the idea here. That burial place is the direction of where someone is going. It's the direction of the final, the ultimate destiny, and it's a different destiny. And when they realized that, then they were upset. They finally heard him. They finally understood this unique. You can't put us in a box. A Jew's not a ger, and we're not a toshav. We're a ger toshav. Ger v'toshav anochi machem. And because of that, what happens? They're offended. You want it? You want it in those terms? You're going to pay for it. Arba meo shekel kesef over la socher, international currency. The Rav, when he was teaching, he says the famous incident after the death of Baron Edmund de Rothschild. Baron Edmund de Rothschild, the famous Rothschild banking family, had three branches. The German branch, based in Frankfurt am Main, the French branch, the Parisian branch, and of course the third is the branch based in London, the British branch. So we're talking about the French Rothschilds. Baron Edmund left in his tzava that he wanted to be buried in Israel. You're all familiar with the fact that it was the Rothschilds who developed the whole area of Zichron Yaakov, the Carmel winery, etc. He wanted to be buried. He had a burial plot stuck out. If he couldn't live in Israel, he invested in Israel. Ultimately, his destiny would be to be buried there. After he dies, Charles de Gaulle, the Prime Minister of France, contacts the family, contacts the Rothschilds, and he wants to give Baron Edmund a French national burial. He wants to give him the highest honors that any French citizen can receive. And they explained to him that our grandfather in his will left commanded us that he wants to be buried in Israel. He wants his remains taken to Israel. And by the way, you can go to his burial site. It's a place called Har HaNadiv. Har HaNadiv, the mountain of the philanthropist. That's where he's buried till this day. And what happened? De Gaulle was infuriated. He was very upset. He lived as a Frenchman. He should die as a Frenchman. I won't allow you to take the remains out. Well, they had their attorneys, and by law there was nothing he could do to prevent it. But the relationship between de Gaulle and the Rothschilds was never the same after that incident. That is exactly what happened here with the Hittites, with Ephron, in their discussions with Avram Avinu. And that is our definition as a Jew. That's who we're defined as. Ger v'toshav anochi imachem. We're not a ger, we're not a toshav. We're ger v'toshav. It's a unique, distinct destiny. And they don't understand it. And we get accused of being, of not being loyal. And we get accused of dual loyalties. It's not so. We don't have dual loyalties. We have a different definition. That's what Avram was teaching us. The last point, we have a few minutes, we're going to say it very briefly, is an idea the Rav said at the beginning of Parshas Toldos. When it describes Yitzchak, it says the following. And this I heard in the name of the Rav from our former president, Julie Berman, Rabbi Dr. Julius Berman. He shared this with me. It says, Ve'ela Toldos Yitzchak ben Avram. Avraham holidas Yitzchak. What are, either you want to call it the events, the occurrences in his life, that's one explanation of Toldos, or these are the children, the legacy, the descendants, the biological descendants of Yitzchak. And how does it start out? Avraham gave birth to Yitzchak. That doesn't belong there. What's Avraham doing there? Should get into Esav and Yaakov. Get into the events of his life as a father, building the nation. What do you have to tell us? Avram holidas Yitzchak. That bothers everyone. So listen to Rashi. Lefi shahayu leitzanei hador omrim. What were the cynics, the mockers of the generation saying? Me'aviat melech nis abra Sarah. Sarah conceived from Avimelech. He's not Avram's kid. He's Avimelech's kid. Yeah, when she's abducted by Avimelech, that's when she conceived. Sharei kam mashanim sha'asay Avraham v'lo nis abra mimenu. Look at all the years she lived with Abe. Never conceived from him. Me'asa, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, what did the Almighty do? What did the Holy One, blessed be He, do? Tsar klaster panav shel Yitzchak, doma la'Avram. Vehidu, and it testified. The fact that Yitzchak looked just like his father. God, through the genes, set up a Yitzchak who looked just like his father. And everyone had to acknowledge and testify that Avram holidas Yitzchak. So a couple of questions. What do you mean the cynics of the generation were saying this? I mean, it's ludicrous. Avram never had a fertility issue. He had a grown son, Yishmael. Avraham, after this event, after Sarah dies, has children from Keturah. Rashi's tradition is that Keturah was Hagar. He has 6 more children. There's no question about Avraham's ability to produce children. He wasn't infertile. The problem was with Sarah. What do you mean that they're mocking that Avram didn't have that kid? And then something else. What happens in Yitzchak's life? Of all the things we're not told, blocks of 50, 60 years, gaps are missing. But what are we told about Yitzchak? We're told about the wells. The wells along the Gaza Strip that Avraham dug and that Avraham had working in his lifetime, the Pelishtim, after he died, they stopped them up. Sitmum Pelishtim. They closed off those wells and stopped them up. And what does Yitzchak do? He and his staff, they go and they reopen and reestablish these wells. What do we have to know that for? There's so many crucial things we'd love to know. The event about him opening up wells that were closed up by the Pelishtim, that's so important to tell us? What's going on? So what the Rav wanted to say, and we're saying it, we say Bekitzer Nimrods, we're saying it in the shorthand version. What the Rav wanted to say, Zatzal, was the following. See, the Pelishtim, as long as Avram's alive, what do you do with him? I mean, people revere him. They don't just revere him, they love him. He's the Baal Chesed. No one treats people the way Avram and Sarah did. He's successful. You can't argue with success. You can't mess with him. Look what happened when they tried to mess with him. In the end, they were forced to make a covenant and a treaty with him. So while he's alive, it's one thing. You have to acknowledge him. You have to give him his due. You have to respect him. But you know what? After he's dead, let's put an end to him. His different philosophy, his different theology, his different standards, his different way of life. So we can't deal with him while he's alive, but after he's dead, let's put an end to him. What does it mean that they stopped up the wells? Wells were important. That was the via maris. They could have made money off those wells. They could have developed communities off those wells. They don't want them being known as Abraham's wells. They want to totally do what? They want to erase his memory from history because he's a threat. Because he's different, because he's unique and distinct, he's a threat. And you know what the idea is? Avram didn't give birth to this kid. He's a Pelishti. This is a Pelishti kid. You want to deny any continuity. You want to deny a future to Avraham. You don't know how to deal with him while he's alive. You have to acknowledge him. After he's dead, time will forget him. Let's put an end to him. Let's make sure that the generations don't take his different approach. They don't take that approach that is unique and distinct and that threatens every one of us. That's the late Sanei Hador. They didn't believe it. It's not something they believed. Why were they saying this? It's irrational. It seems illogical. They weren't irrational. They were saying something that was irrational, but there was a philosophy behind it. The reason they were saying it is because they wanted to put an end to Avraham and to everything he stood for. Remember, except for the Jewish people, and that's post-Har Sinai, we look at patrilineal when it comes to the Umos HaOlam, when it comes to the families, Goyei Haaretz, the Mishpachos, the different families of the nation. It follows the father. So this is a Pelishti child. These are Pelishtim. They're not children of Avraham. That is what they wanted to stop. It sounds familiar. It's the story of Arafat today, denying that there's a Jewish presence on the Temple Mount, denying the Jewish presence in Hebron, denying everything, our commitment to the land, our history on the land, that this is the covenant that God made with us. It's a denying of the religion, the whole notion of the succession, of replacing Judaism as the religion, of turning the Akedah, not from Akedas Yitzchak, but to Akedas Yishmael. It's trying to undermine the very legitimacy, underline our historical rights, our historical relationship, undermine everything that has existed for 4 millennia, for close to 2 millennia, more than 2 millennia, before there ever was in Islam. You had Avraham and Sarah in their community, but it's being hijacked. Because that way you try to write off the Jew. You try to prevent his future. You try to prevent the future, the destiny, the continuity, the legacy of the Jewish people. That's what was happening. And that's why everyone had to realize Avram's not dead. He's not dead biologically. He's not only not dead biologically, he's got a son who follows that legacy, who now is going to expand the community, who's now going to expand everything that Avram and Sarah started. And that's the idea of the wells as well, that there is a future, that it's not a one-generation aberration, but what? That there's an eternal community, an eternal vision, an eternal destiny. That's what's happening, says the Rav Zatzal. So we've had 3 ideas. What was the unique eulogy that the Almighty gave to Sarah Imenu, and what does it teach us about how our lives should be, how we should go through the different stages in life? What exactly was happening with the sale of Ma'aras HaMachpelah, the incident between Avraham and the Chittim? And what at the beginning of Parshas Toldos are we being told about Yitzchak and the future of Avraham? Through his biological son, and not only through the biological son, but through the continuity of everything that Avraham built and started to the next generations. Thank you.